Grazie mille, Mr. Argento, for being with us here. Like, obviously, you are in a room full of people who adore you and adore your work. I am hugely inspired by your work. As a teenager, I grew up and was astounded by the visual beauty, the nightmare, the dream, the horror, the gorgeousness. And I know you've inspired my generation of filmmakers, and you've also inspired many other generations of filmmakers, including John Carpenter, Wes Craven, Guillermo del Toro, Brian De Palma, many, many more. And I wanted to begin by asking you about your formative years and growing up at a really exciting time for Italian cinema, and who were the filmmakers or artists who inspired your passion for cinema and perhaps influenced your work as well?
Non ce ne sono state.
There weren't any.
Okay.
Però ci sono stati dei registi che hanno fatto dei film di piccola importanza. Ad esempio Mario Bava e Riccardo Freda.
But there weren't sort of directors who were slightly sidelined, like Bava and Freda, who did interesting things.
Sì, Freda, gotico, tremendo, Bava più umoristico, più fine.
Freda with this dark gothic undertones, and Bava with that meandering sense of humor who would give him a lightness of touch.
Però quello che mi hanno ispirato molto sono stati i registi americani. Non so, ad esempio mi ha molto ispirato negli anni 50, negli anni 40, 50, 60, un grande autore come Val Newton.
So it looked more to the USA, and if we go back to the decades of 1940s, 50s, and 60s, for instance, Newton was somebody that he looked up to.
Che faceva produttore per la RKO, e però faceva anche il regista.
He was a producer for RKO, but also was a film director himself.
E lanciò alcuni dei più grandi autori di film noir della storia del cinema, come Jacques Tourneur, come Mark Robson, come Robert Wise, realizzando dei film bellissimi, meravigliosi, che all'epoca il cinema horror non veniva molto apprezzato.
So he was crucial in launching the careers of the filmmakers that he mentioned, more in the noir genre, because really looking back to that era, horror, did it exist as a genre, really? And if it did, it wasn't really appreciated.
Sì, però è rimasto un genio del cinema.
But it was still a genius of cinema, and it cast the foundations for a certain type of language.
Sì, quasi contemporanea c'era un altro, c'era Roger Corman. Roger Corman che aveva la sua factory anche, dove c'erano attori famosi, scozzesi, tanti attori, Stallone, insomma erano molti attori, faceva quasi 50 film all'anno. era un altro che contemporaneamente faceva film horror.
And as we know, apart from his main films on the sideline, Coleman was making horror movies. So maybe there was, at the beginning, when he was in his formative years, there was that fil rouge of people who wanted to break into creating horror, but had to do something else as their main job.
Però il cinema horror non era apprezzato all'epoca.
But horror was really not appreciated at the time.
Right, wow, that's very interesting, actually, yeah. And I believe you began your career as a film critic, and then you moved into writing screenplays, and of course, you famously wrote the outline for Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in the West. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how that came about and the experience of writing for other directors.
Sì, io ho fatto prima il critico,
Sì.
poi ho fatto lo sceneggiatore. E come sceneggiatore ho fatto tutti i generi, ho fatto western, ho fatto film
Ma il
di
salto
tutti.
da critico a sceneggiatore?
Sì, il passaggio è abbastanza semplice perché come critico ho visto migliaia di film e quindi poi dopo è stato facile poi scrivere questi film. Poi io ho vissuto a Parigi perché ho studiato a Parigi e il pomeriggio di tutti i giorni andavo alla Cinémathèque française dove facevano un sacco di film distribuiti e mi vedevo 2 film almeno e quindi ho visto tutti i film antichi, film bianco e nero, i film dell'espressionismo tedesco, film capolavori e la Nouvelle Vague. Ho capito che cosa voleva dire la Nouvelle Vague.
Dario is saying that there isn't that much of a jarring jump. If you are a critic and you take your job very seriously, he said he saw thousands of films. So once he became a scriptwriter, he had that as his own knowledge and know-how. When he lived in Paris, where he studied, every afternoon he would go to the Cinéthèque Française and he would see at least 2 movies. And he saw the great, great masterpieces of the past from the Nouvelle Vague, French, and the German Expressionism. And they were total masterpieces, and you cannot but absorb that as your own language when you start being a scriptwriter.
And that's beautiful. And then in 1970, obviously, you released your debut feature, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. And your work straddles this line between thriller and horror often. And it began right there in that film. I wondered if you could tell us how that directorial debut came about and if you always knew you would work in the dark genres.
Non pensavo che avrei fatto il regista, pensavo che sarei rimasto sceneggiatore, che mi piaceva molto scrivere. Quanto si guarda l'uccello dalle piume di cristallo, il successo del film era dato da alcune particolari. Ad esempio il film c'era molta psicologia, si rivolgeva anche alla psicanalisi, aveva tutta qualcosa di diverso, non era il solito film di violenza, di poliziesco, no? Ma aveva qualcosa di nuovo ed è stato questo qualcosa di nuovo che l'ha lanciato poi nel mondo e poi tanti registi l'hanno imitato.
Dario didn't think he was going to become a film director. He actually envisaged his life as a scriptwriter. But he thinks that there are a couple of elements that really made Bird stand out from the rest. It wasn't your normal police thriller. It's more the psychological elements that had not been used in the genre before. So it's the inner life of the characters that you get engulfed by and you want to follow. So he thinks that was his contribution and what really got picked up and imitated then afterwards by so many people.
Mm-hmm.
Ma allora come hai fatto il salto da regista? Cos'è stato che ha fatto scattare?
Non lo so.
I can't remember how he directed, how he came to direct.
Well, we have a clip from The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, so if we can play the first clip, we'll have a look at that.
Volevo dire una cosa, che questa sequenza chiaramente è una specie di manifesto del film, del film che è psicanalitico, psicanalisi, c'è c'è, c'è tutta lui rinchiuso, insomma, c'è la psicanalisi. E poi un'altra cosa importante, avete sentito questa musica? La musica è di Ennio Morricone, il grande Ennio Morricone, maestro della musica. E questa musica che sentite è tutta improvvisata, non l'ha scritta per il film. Lui e il suo gruppo la improvvisavano man mano che passavano le scene, improvvisavano la musica e quindi è tutta improvvisata, non è scritta, non c'è spartito.
So what he wanted to stress is that the sequence you just saw is like a manifesto of the whole film. The fact that the main character is encased in his own psyche as well as physically in between glass. And also the music you heard was composed by the Ennio Morricone, but he never wrote the score. Himself and his group were improvising the music as they were watching the scene. So there isn't a written score as such. It was just the feedback improvisation upon seeing the scene.
Mm. I love that moment of silence at the end as well, and it makes so much sense what you're talking about, this internal world of the character. And that idea of him being trapped as well, this kind of terror of watching something, terror of watching violence and not being able to do anything about it becomes a kind of motif in your work. It obviously most notably in opera. So it's interesting that you bring that up, because I wanted to ask about that motif, and perhaps it's referencing the audience experience maybe, or maybe something else.
Questo è uno dei principi della psicanalisi, quindi grandi psicanalisti possono raccontare meglio di me questa cosa.
Sì, che sia anche l'atto di essere il pubblico al cinema, di vedere qualcosa senza poter fare niente.
Sì, ma diceva Sigmund Freud che il cinema è un atto importante della psicanalisi, perché tu ti trovi da solo al buio, con le scene che appaiono davanti a te grandi, e partecipi praticamente senza dover far nulla. Questo era, infatti diceva Sigmund Freud che il cinema è uno dei più alti punti della psicanalisi.
Definitely, and as you picked up, it's got this psychoanalytical themes that run throughout his work. But Sigmund Freud, to quote somebody, said that the cinema is a really important point in psychoanalysis, in so much that you are, as far as you're concerned, alone in the dark, even though it is a communal experience, but it's also a very individual experience as well. And you're there and you see something which is much larger than in real life, but your participation is to watch something, not to participate in the action. And Sigmund Freud, even way back then, thought that had very, very important psychoanalytical connotations.
And the setting of this scene feels so perfect when you think that this is your first feature and it's the first attack scene in your first feature, and it doesn't happen in a dark back alley. It happens almost on stage. It feels like the spectacle of horror, the spectacle of murder happening in this brightly lit, beautiful art gallery. And I'm interested to know, because the art world then also recurs in your other work with characters who are musicians and dancers, art galleries. What keeps you coming back to that art world, do you think, in the settings and stories?
è un rapporto molto, molto profondo e molto... Cioè, io adoro l'arte, la pittura, l'architettura, adoro la scultura, la musica, tutto ciò che è artistico che è ben fatto naturalmente. Io adoro e cerco di metterlo nei miei film. Ad esempio in Profondo Rosso molto De Chirico con il suo strano mondo inventato, queste piazze, metafisico. Insomma, nei miei film puoi riscontrare un continuo rimando all'arte, al mondo dell'arte.
He absolutely adores art, architecture, paintings, sculptures, music, you name it. He has a deep, profound relationship with everything artistic. And for instance, in Deep Red, he used a lot the paintings of this Italian painter De Chirico and these invented metaphysical landscapes, these drawn almost totally empty landscapes and imagined architecture.
This was your announcement, this film, as a director, and you then went on to make your next two films. Well, they were released in 1971, The Cat of Nine Tails and Four Flies on Grey Velvet. What was it like, that period for you, being announced as a director and then making your next two films in what appears to be very quick succession?
Volevo raccontare, avevo come una furia dentro di me, volevo raccontare, mi era piaciuto molto fare il primo film, quindi adoravo adesso fare altri. E quindi ho fatto una trilogia cosiddetta degli animali, sì. E è stata fatta in 2 anni in tutto, è stato bello, bellissimo. Poi è cambiato tutto.
It actually, much to his surprise, he loved making the first film. And at that point, he felt almost a fury inside, in his words, to get out something that he had this urge of telling it in a cinematic way. So the 3 films came out, what was then described as the Animal Trilogy. Mm-hmm. And it was a beautiful, intense, and highly creative period. Then everything changed.
I'm so intrigued. It changed in what way?
È cambiato perché, ad esempio, dopo ho fatto Profondo Rosso, che non era più nello stile dei primi 3 film. Era un film molto sognato, molto come fosse appunto un sogno, qualcosa di inventato, con una musica differente, una musica completamente differente dagli altri, un rock progressive molto, molto bello, fatto da dei giovanissimi ragazzi di 22 anni che avevano appena fatto il conservatorio, e si chiamavano i Goblin, e hanno fatto questa musica che ha avuto molto successo, e quello è stato, quel film ha cambiato poi di nuovo la mia vita. E poi in seguito c'è stato un altro cambiamento, il film seguente dopo Profondo Rosso. Dopo c'è stato un grande cambiamento che è stato Suspiria, perché ho detto adesso basta di fare film realistici con le persone normali che girano per la strada, automobili. No, facciamo qualcosa di pazzo. E così ho fatto un film sulle streghe.
Because there's a cohesion and a special language and atmosphere in the first 3 films, and the fact that Lambert together makes sense. And after he explored that language and visuals in the first three films, when he made Deep Red, it had a different texture, was very dreamlike, very oniric. And the soundtrack as well has a completely different flavor, if you want. And as you know, it was made by, at the time, a really young guys. They were in the very early 20s, Goblin, and they just graduated from the conservatoire, and they came out with that astounding soundtrack. But then things changed again with Suspiria, because Dario thought, I'm actually fed up with filming real people walking down real streets doing real things. So you made a film about witches. As you do.
Perfect. We actually have a clip from Suspiria, so we should perhaps go to that next. I think Suspiria is probably one of the most visually astounding films of all time. It's like this kind of haunted fairy tale, you know, and you fuse this fantasy with horror. And I'm really interested in the design of the world. I know you worked with Giuseppe Bassan, who you also worked with on Deep Red and Tenebrae. I'd love to hear about, you know, how you designed the world, because even the walls are just iconic. How did you design the world and how did you bring it to life in this film?
Ci siamo ispirati per il colore al Technicolor, il primo Technicolor americano, quello di John Ford, di Howard Hawks, quello dei tramonti rossi, delle divise blu, anche Walt Disney, Cinderella, cioè quei colori forti, rossi, blu, giallo, quei colori forti, potenti. Volevamo fare un film con questi colori. È stato molto importante per il film. E poi il resto era tutto una costruzione, un'idea, un'invenzione dello scenografo e mia anche le carte da parati abbiamo inventato. Poi facevamo che il muro, invece che il muro delle casa, dentro la casa, ci fosse un tessuto, un tessuto rosso. Dietro il tessuto rosso noi mettevamo delle luci e le luci filtravano sul volto degli attori che passavano, ed era uno strano effetto.
Well, the palette was inspired by the very early American Technicolor films. Think John Ford and the saturated sunsets and the blue of the uniforms, but also the saturation of colors in Disney. There's really strong colors that make a statement. As far as the interiors were concerned, for instance, because they built everything, the walls are not walls, but they're made of stretch fabric, so that when you have a red, seemingly solid wall, you can still shine lights behind it that reflect onto the actors' faces. To give that eerie feeling that you're not quite sure how it is achieved.
Do you remember what it was like to shoot this particular sequence? I'd love to know about the kind of...
Se ti ricordi esattamente com'è stato filmare questa sequenza che abbiamo appena visto. Le piacerebbe molto sapere.
Questa della ragazza impiccata?
Sì.
Noi abbiamo messo molto tempo, abbiamo girato in tanti giorni, è stato molto, molto complicato.
It took a very long time, very many days, it was very complicated to shoot.
Did you enjoy it? Do you enjoy the experience? Do you enjoy the experience of being on set? Because it's obviously very stressful, but did you enjoy this scene?
Sì.
Esatto, se ti sei anche divertito, sì, capiamo che è una condizione intensa, ma c'era anche gioia nel
Sì,
finale.
c'era felicità, c'era.
Happiness.
Oh, that's... Well, it brings us a lot of happiness too, so that worked. You're probably, like, your death sequences are always so creative, they're like impeccable. I wonder if you have a favorite from your archive of deaths. I mean, I can think of a few brilliant decapitations that you've done, or perhaps the most challenging even.
Ma sono state tutte molto difficili, devo dire. Quando vuoi fare una scena di questo tipo, fatta bene, è difficile. Devi studiare, ci sono effetti speciali, è molto difficile. Io mi sono sempre molto impegnato.
It took a lot, because when you know what you want to achieve and you don't rely on cliches, you really have to strive for something difficult. So it is difficult to achieve that. He has to say that he really always put a lot of work in what he did in order to achieve exactly what he wanted.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it shows. It's beautiful. And yeah, The decapitation that comes to mind is in Trauma. There's the lift one that you did with Tom Savini, where the lift comes down on his head, and
Yes.
I just think it's excellent.
Con Savini.
Sì, con l'ascensore.
Sì.
What's your second favorite?
It's a good question. There's a lot to choose from. And your films capture a sense of panic amazingly. And I wondered if there's anything that frightens you, and whether or not, you know, your own fears are the things that kind of propel your ideas in terms of these kinds of sequences or your stories.
No, sono mie paure interiori.
There is own inner fears that you get transposed onto the scenes.
Poi volevo dire una cosa, che il cinema horror è ciclico. Ci sono dei cicli, ad esempio gli anni 30, poi c'è il ciclo appunto di Val Newton, anni 50-40, poi insomma è ciclico, ci sono momenti che diventa bellissimo e poi sparisce. Così è successo anche al cinema italiano del horror, che era ai tempi appunto dei Bava che era bellissimo, poi è sparito, scomparso. Così anche in Inghilterra c'è stata la Hammer Film, che era una grande compagnia, per 15 anni ha dominato il mercato dell'horror, e poi pian piano si è stranamente. Pensare che il primo film horror a colori è stato fatto dalla Hammer Film, che era Frankenstein, ed era film a colori, il primo film a colori horror.
So that also what I wanted to point out is the cyclical life of horror films in different decades. We talked about the 30s and the 50s, 60s. Like in Italy with Bava, it had reached a peak and then it sort of fizzled out. And also with Hammer Films in this country, bearing in mind that they were producing so many horror films, and actually the first color horror movie was made by Hammer, Frankenstein. But then something happens and the wave seems to fizzle out. Per quale ragione?
Perché i gusti del pubblico cambiano.
Because the audience's taste change.
E quindi deve cambiare anche il cinema.
And so that is reflected in cinema as well.
And talking of kind of eras of horror, Suspiria and also Tenebrae were caught up here in the UK in the video nasty hysteria, panic surrounding what horror films were going to do to us. You know, were they going to turn us all into psychopaths and murderers? And everybody here in the UK got, we say their knick is in a twist about horror.
In Italian.
I don't know how you translate that, I'm sorry. I wondered how aware of Britain's panic around video nasties you were. And also I think Suspiria was only released uncut here in 1998. So how do you feel about your films being censored around the world in this way?
Ma sì, io ero al corrente benissimo, sapevo benissimo quello che succedeva. Sapevo che i miei film erano censurati in quasi tutti i paesi. In alcuni paesi erano completamente banned, completamente
Al bando.
sì, vietati. Non so, ad esempio il mio film Opera è stato uscito con 25 minuti di tagli. è così. Per esempio, in altri film quasi, i primi film, per esempio in Russia, non sono mai usciti. Poi improvvisamente è uscita il DVD e ha avuto un grande successo. Tutti i giornali parlavano di questi film, che erano vecchi di 20 anni.
So yes, he was very much aware, but it was not something out of the ordinary, because so many of his films were not only censored, sometimes they were altogether banned in many countries. And for instance, in Russia, the Animal trilogy did not come out at all for 20 years. And then he had an enormous success because with DVDs, there was that bypass of the distribution obstacles. But opera, in quale paese di 825?
In tutti i paesi.
Opera was curtailed by 25 minutes in every single country where it was distributed.
Perché era stato prodotto da una casa americana.
Because it was produced by the Americans, so say no more.
Sì, e quindi questi americani pensavano che era troppo, era eccessivo. Io mi sono molto battuto, ma Poi però dopo 5-6 anni hanno capito che era una stupidaggine e il film è uscito normale, che adesso si vede il film, la vera versione originale.
So Dario at the time fought a lot in order to restore the 25 missing minutes, and apparently friends from the other side of the pond came to their senses about after 5 or 6 years. So they reintroduced the 25 missing minutes. And now they realize that that's how it should have been seen in the first place.
But it's frustrating, right, as a creative
Sì,
person.
sì,
Yeah.
sì,
Yeah.
very frustrating.
You've created this artwork and then somebody comes and chops it up. We have a clip from the Stendhal syndrome, so we're going to leap forwards in time and have a look at that now. I love that sequence. I just think like, wow, where are we going? And then we're in this kind of weird dream, you know. And I think, I mean, there's so much I admire about you as a filmmaker, but I think one of the things I admire the most is that I feel like I'm watching an artist who's completely liberated creatively. You know, it doesn't feel like talking about censorship, it feels like you're totally uncensored, and there's this real sort of sense of courage and boldness. And I wondered if that was how it felt making your work, or if you felt that you were ever hemmed in any way by the industry or by producers or by yourself even, creatively.
No, perché io ero anche produttore dei miei film, quindi facevo come volevo io. E così ho fatto sempre, rischiando la censura, però l'ho fatto. Sono stato anche accusato, potevo andare anche in prigione, però mi sono sempre battuto e questo è stato il mio esempio, questo film, questo è uno dei film più significativi della mia opera, perché c'è proprio tutta la psicanalisi di cui parlavo. Infatti è tratto da un libro di una psicanalista famosa, si chiama Magherini, che è la primaria dell'Istituto di Psichiatria di Firenze, dove a Firenze accadono il maggior numero di casi di sindrome di Stendhal, perché ci sono questi quadri meravigliosi e la gente si sente male. Dai tempi di Stendhal fino ad oggi tutti hanno avuto qualche cosa di visitando gli Uffizi, ad esempio.
No, it didn't feel hemmed in, as you mentioned, by the industry, but do bear in mind that it was his own producer. So what the risk that he ran, and he knew full well that he was running it, was censorship, as we discussed, sometimes even jail, because some people took great offense to certain things, but artistically, no, it didn't have to turn down anything. And the Stendhal Syndrome is a very important film in his opus and for himself, because we see what we talked about before, psychoanalysis, and it is based on the book by a psychoanalyst who is the head of a very important ward in Florence. And in Florence is where the most cases of Stendhal syndrome actually occur, because you are faced with this bevy of fantastic paintings that are not just paintings, they're worlds that draw you in. And so it actually happens so many times during any given year that people faint or undergo some sort of real experience by visiting the Uffizi.
Well, I kind of want to go and see that
for
myself
now.
Did you ever witness that happening in a...
L'hai mai visto succedere?
No, mai.
It actually happened.
No, mai,
it happened
però
to you. Okay.
ho molte testimonianze di questi professori, di questi medici che hanno
But this psychoanalyst team witnessed, studied, and actually taken down the accounts of people who underwent this experience, which is very, very physical and real.
That's amazing. And I think we want to go to another clip actually now. So you released Dark Glasses, of course, your latest film. So I wanted to go to a clip of that so we can just talk a little bit about working today. So we'll go to the next clip.
Fatti guardare, immagino che sei disposta a tutto.
No.
Se io voglio fare l'FF.
Ah, mi dispiace, no, io queste cose non le faccio. Non lo so che cos'è il fisting, però io questo schifo non lo faccio, ok?
Scusa, qual è il problema? Io ti faccio godere.
Senti, io non voglio orgasmi e soprattutto non da te, va bene?
Senti, allora, perdonami, ma io ti do tanti bei soldini.
No, non è una questione di soldini, è una questione che io questo schifo non lo faccio!
Adesso ci penso io. Ma che cazzo hai fatto? Troia di merda!
Stronzo! Vaffanculo!
So you've been making films for over 50 years and you're still going so strong. How has the landscape of filmmaking and in particular perhaps horror as a genre, how has that changed, do you think, today compared to when you began, if that's not too big a question to ask?
Yeah,
Sì, un po' ampia.
It is a big.
Sorry.
È difficile dirsi, però il cinema è cambiato come siamo cambiati noi, è cambiata le città, è cambiato tutto, è cambiato il modo di vedere il film. Ad esempio adesso hanno chiuso quasi tutti i cinema, hanno chiuso, e invece molti si vedono i film, li vedono sul computer, in internet, ma non è il modo giusto di vedere un film, perché come diceva appunto prima, diceva di Freud, che diceva la sala buia, tu sei solo davanti allo schermo. Questo era il modo migliore di vedere un film.
like everything changed in the world in the past 50 years. But as far as cinema is concerned, maybe the biggest change is the experience itself, because so many cinemas have now closed, especially in smaller towns. So as we were saying before, as Sigmund Freud said, the experience of being alone in the dark in front of this lit enormous screen is not the same as watching it on a screen, big, in your home. And it's not how films ought to be experienced, really.
I completely agree. And yes, I'm sure that everybody here agrees with that too. And just one last question as well. So you've had some amazing collaborations with other filmmakers over the years, including, I think you worked briefly on a project with Sam Raimi and George Romero, and most recently you starred in Vortex for Gaspar Noé. And I'm really interested to know what that experience was like for you. I have to say, I thought your performance was absolutely amazing and the best heart attack I've ever seen on screen.
Come è stata la tua esperienza e se la ripeterai?
No, è stata la prima e unica esperienza che ho avuto io come attore, con un mio amico che è Gaspar Noé, che è un mio amico carissimo da tanti anni. Ho fatto... Il film è improvvisato, non c'è un copione. Non esiste il copione del film, ci sono 8 pagine che ha scritto lui per scherzo quasi. E ci diceva ogni mattina, si discuteva con gli altri 2 attori, facciamo così, e improvvisavamo. Io recitavo in una lingua che non era mia, in francese, però siccome io ho studiato in Francia, lo conosco il francese. È stata un'esperienza bellissima, che non ripeterò penso mai più.
So first and foremost, they're exceedingly good friends and they've known each other for a very long time. It was an unscripted film. There were 8 pages jotted down with notes, and every morning Dario and the other 2 actors would discuss how the scene would progress. And obviously Dario had to act in, not in his own language, but then of course, as we said, he lived and studied in France, so that was his second language. And it was a beautiful, fantastic experience that he will never repeat again.
Well. I just want to say thank you so much for this. It's been amazing. Grazie mille. Thank you for terrorizing us for generations with your beautiful work. And thank you to the BFI for organizing this. I mean, we all love you. So can we just give Mr. Argento a huge round of applause?